and we can take whatever they supposedly own because they don't really own those goods. See, this is the justification. You understand? This is the justification. This is the same mentality that runs amok even to this day up in Iao. See, it's the same mentality. The same mentality that for a minority of ideas, for those who benefit, exploit, they can turn away, dehumanize, and take as they please. See, this is nothing new. Inter Cetera in 1493, of course, the year after Columbus, Pope Alexander VI issued, granting to Spain the right to conquer the lands which Columbus had already found, as well as any lands which Spain might discover in the future. That the discovered people be subjugated, and brought to the faith itself. Not by free choice, not because it's such a loving religion, not because it's going to bring love and civilization to people, but the idea we can take what's theirs. We can kill, we can rape, we can pillage, we can plunder, we can conquer. And this has its foundation in that mentality. The mentality which still exists in this world to this day. So the idea of genocide and conquest from the very beginning comes with the name Columbus. Anytime we hear the name Columbus, with the name we should realize comes conquest and murder and genocide and subjugation. His name should be seen not as a name to be honored, but a name which should reek and the stench of inhumanity and the disregard for a fellow human being in their humanity. And what it is, it justified an incredibly brutal system of colonization, which main idea was to first to dehumanize, to remove from the so-called, what they saw as being the lesser human being, whatever kept them to be seen as a human being. And that they had, this was a so-called divine right. It was sanctioned by God in their own eyes, in their own views that they represented God, to claim absolute title and ultimate authority. And we think about Christopher Columbus, as we have seen in many of the images, again sailing on a Nina and a Pinta and the Santa Maria, come across that ocean blue, comes across the land, Hispaniola. And what does he do to make claim? He plants a flag. Wow. That's it. Plants a flag, does a prayer, and it's theirs. Simply. That becomes the so-called transfer of title. That becomes the legitimacy in regards to the plunder, in regards to the absolute control of the peoples who had been there for thousands upon thousands of years. That this act of possession was based on a religious doctrine. And again, to understand this doctrine, of course, is the doctrine of discovery. Now, many of you might look at that and go, so what's the big deal of the doctrine of discovery? And I'll come to that again real soon. Sorry.
What?
Oh, this one calling me. Well, the doctrine of discovery, whether you know it or not, in fact, is foundational even within the United States framework of legal law and control of the so-called islands. Sorry, not just the islands of Hawaii, I should say, but between the confines of what's called the United States of America. The doctrine of discovery becomes the alibi. It becomes the legitimacy, the story, the narrative, the idea, the so-called natives were less than human beings. And it was, in fact, in their own good that they be subjugated and murdered and exploited. And when Columbus first comes, and I'll talk more about this tonight, you need to understand what kind of person Columbus was. And if you take a look at some of the documents provided by De Las Casas, you will find, in fact, some of the most brutal crimes ever committed against humanity was committed by Christopher Columbus, who coming upon a village because they were so crazed with the idea of getting gold to exploit, that they set upon the peoples there, first with their armies and their horses, to mutilate and kill and subjugate as many natives that they could. Then they would to capture whatever bodies that they could capture. Now, what was the purpose of capturing the so-called Taino and Arawak peoples? Slavery, exactly. So we must remember, what becomes the transatlantic slave trade? The whole history of slavery began with Columbus. In fact, thousands of so-called Caribbean natives from that era, the first ones were taken back to places like Spain and Europe and used as slaves. Then others within the Caribbean was first used to become slaves who worked in the so-called mines. First of all, looking for gold and then for silver. Whereby the millions, and let me repeat, by the millions perished in lands today we call Cuba, we call Puerto Rico, we call Jamaica, we call the Bahamas. This is even before they went on to the so-called Americas. We're still stuck with Columbus, and we're talking millions. Then in order to instill a proper attitude for these natives, the idea was to increase fear in them. And the first thing was to rape and pillage those towns and villages. Then was to bring their man-eating dogs. I repeat, man-eating dogs that they set out to pursue and kill and eat. Can you imagine what it would be like for you to watch your family members, your children, perishing, being eaten by wild, savage dogs? Wait, that's not done yet. Then they would capture the babies. Now this is not KaleiKoa. Another thing I always tell my students, don't believe one word I'm saying today. This is something you should know. And they would take these babies, and in front of their mothers and family members, they would feed those babies alive to these dogs as dog food in order to civilize these so-called savages. And then they would force them to gather gold in the mountains and streams, whatever they could find. And if they had enough to fill what's called a hawk's bill, within a year, then they would be punished, first by cutting off their ears to be marked. So the following year they would know, aha, we're going to try doubly hard on that person the following year. If that person still didn't have enough gold, then they would cut off their hands. And many would die bleeding to death in those lands. This is Columbus. This is the conquistadors. This is the beginning of the European settlement of the so-called New World. See, that's why Columbus is such an important hero for Europeans and the coming of Europe in the so-called New World. Columbus establishes, legitimizes their presence. It gives them the so-called excuse that the migration from Europe into the New World, that the subjugation, the destruction, and the outright murder really was for the best interest of the savages themselves. That is the mentality that comes with Columbus. And it's yet only recent, in the past few years, you will see the discourse, even in the educational institution like on this campus, well, people start to speak the truth about people like Columbus and refuse to acknowledge and say, no more, we're going to celebrate the genocidal maniac who makes Hitler look like a little baby. And that's just a fact. Now within that, let me just attach it to the United States. I know I'm kind of getting long-winded already, but that's how I get. We got to understand a little bit about the doctrine of discovery. So you got to say, so what? Well, what you'd understand, these are cornerstone legal precedences that still exist. I'm talking today, in 2016, in Supreme Court decisions, to this day. There's something out there called a Marshall Trilogy. I know I have it here somewhere. Let me kind of find it. I hope I have it here. I don't have it memorized anyway. Yes, that's coming right. Yeah, the Marshall Trilogy. There we go. Yeah, so-called Marshall Trilogy from the great esteemed, looked at the father of the U.S. Supreme Court, John Marshall, who even to this day is seen as this legal hero. But many of them have not yet read his words in regards to what he spoke about so-called the native tribal American Indians and their nations. I'm just going to scrunch down. The first is the case, the Johnson versus McIntosh case, which back in 1823 really is the cornerstone. When you talk about American federal Indian policies that regulate, that control what are the so-called rights of American Indians to this day, the precedence to this day is still the McIntosh case. And really, to just, if you look at the words, you can read to yourself. Horrific kind of ideas. But the basic premise is this. The so-called New World was discovered. And in fact, they mentioned John Cabot, so-called British explorer who comes to North America. And because he discovered North America, and the idea of discovery based upon the principles that it was virtually unpopulated by human beings. Therefore, they could be discovered like wild animals. And being that they weren't really human beings because they weren't Christians and had not yet been baptized, they were seen as being people who did not really own the land. In fact, in subsequent decisions, the ideas was perpetuated even to this day that they weren't really human, therefore they didn't really own the land, so they don't have rights of ownership. What Indians have was called rights of occupancy. Whatever the hell that means. Means they were there, but they didn't own it. And this justifies the idea that all that land that was supposedly discovered by John Cabot now will eventually belong to the United States of America. And what becomes after that point the rest of the whole continent. So it wasn't just the eastern coast of the United States that was discovered, but then again that idea, subsequent, the rest of the whole continent was something that could become conquered. Now I don't have time to go talking about John Cabot, but that's another important name you should go check out. John Cabot, in fact, was a well-known slave shipper. In fact, he made all his wealth being a slave owner and slave shipper. To kind of give you kind of perspective on his mentality. The second big case was the Cherokee Nation versus Georgia. And really what's important about that case, it also, if you understand about the history, the Cherokees who became one of the so-called civilized tribes who adopted particular ways, they had their language and laws, and they were functioning really as a Western so-called civilized government. But when it came down to the fact of who had the real power and who had the real control, that case basically said that the U.S. Congress had what's called plenary power. Meaning in the end, it didn't really matter what the American Indians taught or organized or had governments or had traditional governing structures. Because in the end, all of them are under the political control of the U.S. Congress. Obviously, they didn't ask any of the American Indians who were living there at that time. But the idea forever cemented the idea that political and legal fiction, not just that they own all the land, but all American Indians are under the control of the U.S. Congress. Of course, this was all one-sided, of course. Not something in which American Indians ever gave their consent to. But as you'll see, this will repeat itself over and over. And then the third, the Worcester versus Georgia case. Gotta try to remember about this one now. This was the dependent nations idea. The idea that American Indians inherently are dependent, that their relationship to the United States, in fact, that's the idea of this wardship, that the United States, in fact, when you actually read the language from the Supreme Court, it's horrifying. And the basic idea is we, as the white people of Europe, as the truly civilized Christian people, we have a duty to civilize those savages. And it's because of that we are the true trustees and they are the true wards. And they, in fact, are not real nations. And this idea that's constructed, again, this is the legal fiction that's constructed, that they become domestic nations or dependent nations who really don't know how to govern themselves, and they're lucky, in fact. And it's so fortunate that the Europeans know what's good for them. And so these three cornerstones really are the foundation to how American Indians are treated to this day. Now we look at these laws and we can see them and we can wonder, how the hell can those kinds of ideas, knowing what we know today, still exist within American jurisprudence? Sadly, the fact is, the truth is, even to this day, a Supreme Court in making its decisions and findings, or federal courts in making its decisions and findings, dealing with cases today, look back at those precedences and use those precedents today to determine why American Indians are under the thumb of the United States Congress. So you gotta understand, these are not crimes that happened in the past and disappeared. These are crimes in which our people, many Native peoples to this day, struggle and face. So when people talk about equality within the United States, you gotta kind of understand. When Thomas Jefferson was talking about liberty for all, when Thomas Jefferson was talking about the idea of equality for all, you kind of gotta understand, he wasn't including American Indians within that framework of humanity. He did not include African Americans or Black Americans within that idea, who at that time, in fact, in the creation of the United States, were considered 3/5 of a human being. American Indians were seen, in fact, not even counted as human beings. But sadly, to this day, celebrations like Columbus Day only further secure not just these lies, but further secures these political mythologies, which allow multinational corporations, which allow the so-called 1% to continue to exploit these lands and resources. And of course, all we got to look today, which is probably the most important issue for Native peoples going around today, that's captured in the media, of course, is the issue at Standing Rock, where you have peoples, human beings, who have lived there for thousands of years, want to have the right to determine for themselves, to have clean, healthy water, right for themselves to protect their sacred sites and burial sites, by the way, which was bulldozed a couple of weeks back. So we talk about protections that are given to Arlington Cemetery, or protections that are given to Punchbowl Cemetery, or protections that say, we got to protect the Arizona Memorial because that's sacred, or we got to protect Mount Rushmore because they get best looking European faces you find up there. That's sacred. But Native peoples do not have the luxury to protect what all human beings in the family of nations strive to have. And that's our own humanity as peoples. And see, that's why for me it's such an important event like this, where we share. And I say, this is not a Native issue. This is not an indigenous issue. This is not an Aboriginal issue. This is a human issue for all human beings who live on this planet to understand that justice and equality and the protection of all our humanity is something that we all should be a part of. And that's why days like this are so important, that we gather and we speak and we share, we talk about a better world. We talk about a world where all humanity is seen as equal. So we don't struggle just for Native peoples, you see. We struggle for the rest of humanity. That's what's going on here. And I'm proud of my brothers and sisters who are there, making a stand and rise. As I'm proud of my sisters and brothers who are up in Iao Valley, struggling. As you can see, I mean, look at today. This is a great, I'm saying this is still going on today. Think about that. You heard the list of laws and statutes that are there to protect the rights of people. Historic, environmental, water. And they're pushed aside for what? For what? For whom? For whose benefit? For all of us here who call Maui our home? I don't think so. We can clearly see it's for the benefit of a few. The so-called 1%. Those who control the so-called resources. Who are unwilling. Who don't want to recognize our humanity as people. This is why we had the struggle over KaleiKoa that still continues to this day. And many have told me, oh, KaleiKoa, you guys not going to win that battle. And I said, the fact that we struggle and we fight, we already won. So you don't understand. The fact that we stand and struggle is the fact that we are winning the struggle. See, their game is to believe that somehow we gave up. That yes, we were exterminated. Yes, our minds have been erased. Yes, our cultural identity is gone. But you see, we still stand. We still struggle. We still resist. We still fight back. Struggle is what really gives us life. It's in that struggle that we stand. And we don't, again I say, we don't stand really just for us. But we stand for the humanity in general. Anyway, I'd like to invite all of you, if you get a chance to come by tonight at 6 o'clock, get a bigger presentation. But mahalo for everybody coming. And as I said, don't believe anything I said. Find out for yourself. Empower yourself. Mahalo.